When my parents were told I had ADHD, they were given two options: either medicate me or channel my energy. They opted for the latter, which led to a bizarre combination of hobbies growing up, including, but not limited to, fascination with the Titanic, and I did in fact read this book cover to cover in second grade and can still tell you more facts than you need to know about the Titanic. Building rockets that, yes, actually flew. Showing pigs, this is me at my hometown Kingman County Fair. Artwork of various mediums, and bonus points if you recognize this image. Music, of course, which would become my career in the organ, but among the most enduring of the hobbies, Lionel trains. This table that I am sitting at was built by my dad and I for my 12th birthday. I was so excited to finally get my trains off the floor where they had been for years, and I was even more eager to expand the table. In the process, though, I definitely bit off more than I could chew. I wanted the hyper-realistic and high-end feature layout, and while I did get a couple legacy engines and had some fine scenery, I just didn't have the money or the patience in high school to go all in. The single biggest success was the ball diamond, though, which was inspired by both my older sister and also a dear friend of mine, both of whom played softball at my high school. But nothing beyond that really materialized to its full plan for the layout. And now that I'm married with a daughter and I live away from my parents, there's just not a huge layout in the near future. So I decided to turn my attention to my very first inspiration for model trains, my mom's 1947 Lionel set. I was also inspired by this image that Megan captured of our daughter and I around Christmas time a year ago playing with the train I put under the tree. It all came full circle for me in that moment for what my parents did, and I thought, yeah, I gotta make this happen for my own children. So I scrapped the old layout that sat on this table, but I did save the ball diamond, don't worry. And I decided to build a vintage-inspired Lionel layout, one of imagination and whimsical fun that I could share with my children in the future. So, the first thing to do was to repaint the surface, which started with sanding down the rough bits left over from the previous layout. Then it was on to painting an earth tone undercoat, a nice brown color to act as a canvas for ground cover and the track and such. That signature there was my final mark on the table before covering it with the soundboard that the old track sat on. And with my leftover blue paint, I left a small Jackson Pollock work on there as well. I really just wanted an excuse to flippantly fling paint onto a surface. For this new layer of paint, I'm not concerned about the uniformity or the visible brush strokes because it's just going to be underneath track and ground cover and accessories and such. But after finishing this layer of paint, that would be all for today, because now it was time to let it dry overnight. The next chance I had to work on the layout, I started with yard work. So I just realized that that's a train pun as I'm recording this script. I didn't intend to do that. Anyways, I started with yard work, outside yard work, not rail yard work. Why is this relevant? Because my yard is too small for a full-on lawnmower, but too big to just let it grow, so I have a cheap battery-powered weed whacker. The battery lasts long enough to take care of almost all of the grass in the front, which means I have a good reason to work on the layout while the battery charges in the garage before finishing the yard. That way, when Megan comes and asks what I'm up to, I have an alibi in the charging battery even if I'm very obviously working on the layout. So while I truthfully waited for the battery to charge here, I turned to the next part of the layout, which would also become the most tedious, the track. This is a post-war inspired layout, so we're using classic Lionel tubular O-gauge track. And because I'm poor, but also want to be authentic, this is all used track that I bought at a good price. And because I'm poor and authentic, it means we have to endeavor on cleaning this track thoroughly before it can be put together. Remember that rocketry hobby from earlier? All that sanding from that hobby still comes in handy for stuff like this. Here's a comparison of a cleaned and an uncleaned piece of track. I think the end result has turned out pretty good. Basically what I do is I start with regular sanding, wipe down with a rag, and touch up with a Dremel brush for any thick grime or hard to reach places. And this process I just repeat again and again and again for each individual piece of track. So dozens of pieces of track later, and a pile of dusty grime mingled with sweat falling from my forehead, and it's time for a break. The next day I worked on the layout was also the Solemnity of Mary's Assumption, which is why we wear blue for Our Lady today. With the track cleaned, I could begin to lay it out in its general shape. I didn't just begin to attach track together because sometimes pins need moved and adjustments need made and ideas change, so there's just greater flexibility keeping each piece independent. And while I thought I could begin actually assembling the track, I realized I was short some track and I couldn't figure out why. And then I realized I had planned to cut some straight pieces to accommodate certain shorter sections. But I didn't have anything to cut the track with, so I took that as Mary's way of saying to honor her with something like a rosary instead, and not with model trains today. So after the first of what will become many trips to Home Depot, I had a saw and clamps to cut the track I needed. I hacked a couple pieces and did a quick test fit to make sure they were cut right, sanded down the ends, checked that the pins would go in without difficulty. Now, it was finally time to assemble the track. And this is always the exciting part because it means we're that much closer to maybe getting some trains running today. Anyways, it's time to add some power and do some tests. I attached my lock-on and put on a searchlight car and an operating log dump car to test the power and the operating tracks around the layout, which was all good. At this point, I just pushed the two cars around and made sure there weren't any strange power drops. They navigated the switches just fine. The log dump car worked fine on the siding, except the searchlight car lost all the power. And for the life of me, I could not figure out why. And then as I was editing this video and still tinkering with it, I discovered that it fortunately just turned out to be some loose connections between pins in the track sections. And then came the fun parts. I grabbed my little Penzi 080 steam engine, which is the first engine I bought with my own money, to do some test runs on the layout. It worked just fine, except it would stall at the switches. I later concluded this was just because of the shortness of the engine, so someday I'll have to find a workaround to widen the distance that the engine picks up power from that center rail. So I then grabbed a larger engine, my Santa Fe FT, which handled the loop just fine, and just in time for Megan and Amelia to come and see the layout. And I was glad she walked in when she did, because I can make a much more compelling case to spend money on trains if the trains appear to actually be working. And so with a working loop of track, I added some cars behind the FT to finally run a train. Tested the log dump car, tested the siding, and then just enjoyed that white noise of a clackety-clack electric train going in circles. The single most important thing when building a layout is to always be able to run trains at any given point. Otherwise, it's just a cluttered mess of halfway finished projects. So even with the wires and tools and track that still has yet to be fastened and tidied up, I could take a break and just let the trains run. Thanks for watching. More to come.